Good evening, friends of the Duke Graduate School. I am Alan Kendrick, and on behalf of Dean Paula D. McLean, the Race and Bias Conversations planning team, and all of my colleagues in the graduate school, I consider it a privilege to have you join us for our second conversation in our Race and Bias Conversations. Our first conversation, led by Dean McLean, examined the topic of desegregating private higher education in the South, focusing on the scholarship of Melissa Keene. This evening, we turn our attention to researching the police. I pause here to call the names of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Trayvon Martin, Tony McDade, Dion Johnson, and the many other Black lives that have been snuffed out by police brutality. I am encouraged this evening that Duke is training scholars like our graduate students who will lead our discussion this evening, Ajane Clemens and Arvind Krishnamurthy. And now, let me move out of the way, but just a bit of information about Ajane Clemens. I will be back later to introduce Arvind. Ajane Charisse Clemens is a six-year PhD student in public policy. Her primary research is police community relations. Ajane formerly served in municipal government as an ombudsperson overseeing cases of police misconduct. Now, I always try to bring you some information that you don't know about our students. And Ajane shared with me that years ago, she says, she traveled to Venezuela to teach English. And Ajane and a fellow teacher flew to an archipelago a few hours away from Caracas and camped there on the beach. Being careless, she admits, Ajane nor her colleague shared their plans with family or friends to stay past the weekend. So being concerned, the US State Department got involved and was sent to search for them. Now, Uncle Sam did find them in under 10 minutes. Because it was the town gossip where they were, that two American women were being hosted by a group of lobster fishermen. I'm going to leave you now to unpack all of that and yield the time to you for explanation. Thank you for being with us, Ajane Clemens.
Well, thank you very much, Dean Kendrick, for that true story, unfortunately. And thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's really just a pleasure to join you all. I want to thank also Dean McLean and the entire graduate school Race and Bias planning team who invited Arvind and me to join you today. So really an honor to be here to share with you all my preliminary findings from in-depth interviews on policing I conducted right here in Durham. And I should note that all of these interviews took place right up into the point of COVID. And so they ended up serving as an unexpected snapshot, really, on the eve of this newest round of police protests this summer. So I'm going to take about 20 minutes to discuss the paper I'm developing for my dissertation called How Civilians Assess Police. Many police executives have expressed confusion about what communities really want, as they point to both high volume of calls for service and complaints of overreach. And so this paper focuses on one key research question to help tease out this seeming contradiction. And I hope it's going to lead to a more precise understanding of what these residents really want from their local forces. So how do civilians in heavily policed communities assess police? Residents might view police as incompetent, corrupt, unjust, unreliable, brutal, any one of which could lead to a loss of confidence, faith, and trust, or a loss of legitimacy. Legitimacy in this context is defined as officers having moral authority to which civilians willingly defer and obey. This is an internal feeling people have that police are a righteous authority with whom they ought to comply and cooperate. Legitimacy is broadly applied, though, in political philosophy, and here democratic institutions are characterized by deference and consent. Sir Robert Peel of England is credited with modernizing and professionalizing the police force, motivated by the idea that communities are policed by consent. And so for democratic societies in which the state is monopolizing that coercive power, police authority then must be judged as rightful by the community it serves. For this reason, two prevailing theories explain how civilians' assessment of officers and agencies lead them to view police as legitimate. And both theories claim legitimacy then leads civilians to comply and cooperate, resulting in enhanced public safety. So again, two main competing theories on how police are assessed by civilians. The first model is called police effectiveness, and the second is called procedural justice. So the police effectiveness model asserts that civilians care most about officer and agency competence when evaluating them. They argue that civilians believe the core function of police is to keep them safe from harm by preventing crime and catching criminals. The more they believe their local agency accomplishes these aims, the greater the trust they place in them. Also, proponents would say fear of crime and victimization erode that confidence. So these are a few of the kinds of questions civilians would be asked on surveys assessing police. Rating police on a scale of, say, 1 to 5, from strongly disagree to strongly agree, they might be asked the following. Police are good at catching criminals. Police do a good job of preventing crime. When you need police, they're there or quick to arrive. Police make me feel safer. Or say on a scale of 1 to 5, not very well to very well, how well do police resolve conflicts in my community? How well do police maintain a sense of safety and order? How well do police solve crimes that are important to me? This model asserts that an agency's effectiveness at controlling or solving crime is what legitimates its authority in the eyes of civilians. And again, that legitimacy is then believed to result in civilian compliance and cooperation with police. So the procedural justice model responds to the police effectiveness model to argue that it doesn't just matter that police solve crime. What matters even more is how police treat people. And so Tom Tyler and later Tracy Meares and other colleagues developed the procedural justice model as a response to the way civilians have a sense of fairness. And so they argue that it's actually a fair process that will lead to legitimacy, which will then lead to that compliance and cooperation. So the procedural justice model relies on 4 key components: participation, allowing civilians to have a chance to be heard and tell their side of the story prior to making a decision; impartiality, being transparent about the rules of the road and gathering those facts, again, before making a decision, treating everyone equally; respect, treating civilians with dignity and respect; and benevolence, communicating a sincere interest in civilians' well-being. And so survey questions will then home in on these key elements. What are the results? So these theories have both been tested in the US and abroad, but these are not typically nationally conducted surveys. What's happening is that they're being tested in municipalities, and so they're being done with representative samples of those municipalities. And so in the US, both theories have been tested in cities as disparate as New York City, Omaha, Cincinnati. And Tyler and other researchers have found that procedural justice is deemed to be more important than police effectiveness among white, Black, Latinx, and Muslim populations. And abroad, similar results have been found in the UK among whites and Muslims. Both models tout their generalizability, but I am skeptical that civilians' positionality in society is not playing a larger role in their assessment of police performance than the literature acknowledges. Both theories seem to gloss over people who live in communities with high crime and more intense police misconduct. In a 2017 book, Policing the Black Man, Tyler and Meares argue that people's perceptions are generally out of whack with reality. So crime has indeed been falling for decades in the US, and police are largely lawful in how they behave. But at the same time, Tyler and Meares, tack on at the end of their argument that high crime communities are a sort of special case, but largely hold to their overall claims. And so another gap is that police effectiveness also presumes that a neighborhood is concerned about criminal rather than police behavior. So I really worry that both models discount the full needs and thinking process of a population with profoundly greater exposure to both dangerous criminals and injurious policing. Now, we talked about these representative samples, but what happens when you center this population? Many people treat minorities as homogenous rather than diverse. And for this study, I don't choose any and all Black folk or European Muslims. I interview members of these groups living in neighborhoods with high crime and high police contact, which means there's also going to be high poverty rates. This is the first study I'm aware of that examines procedural justice and police effectiveness qualitatively, comparing two minority groups and in a transnational context. Now, do civilians really think about police assessment in the way that police effectiveness and procedural justice proponents claim? Is this either or framework appropriate or constructive? Do the models even sufficiently capture this population's assessment process? In light of that, here's my research question. How do civilians in heavily policed communities assess police? I conducted 30 interviews in London and 21 in Durham before having to suspend in March due to COVID. And these are 2-hour interviews apiece with about 30 open-ended questions and a short survey at the end, so about 50 questions total. And to identify the correct recruitment areas, I use census data and police enforcement data issued by the Durham and Metropolitan Police Departments. My target age is 18 to 29 years old for males, because this is the highest police contact among adults. And I do on-the-ground recruiting with flyers. I go to barbershops, basketball courts, soccer fields in London, corner stores, grocery stores, fast food places. In London, they're frequently referred to as chicken shops. And this is to make sure that people who live in and frequent these areas are really the ones signing up for the study. So I don't use social media, for example. I really want to limit my sample to a group that's been exposed to the same general policing style. So I'm going to share just the Durham sample, and this is a brief profile. The average man is 24 and a half years old. In terms of education, it ranges from 8th grade to a bachelor's degree, although the typical man has a 12th grade education, has graduated from high school. None had parents or grandparents who were immigrants. 2/3 identified as Christian, with the remainder either agnostic or unsure. 86% reported occupations spanning the private, public, and nonprofit sectors, with construction being really the modal occupation at 29%. The typical man lives in a household of 3, including himself, and rents, with slightly about half of participants having 0 children, a quarter having 1 child, and then the remainder having 2 to 4 children. About 2/3 have been arrested at some point in their lives, with 52% having been convicted of any sort of crime. And so for the remainder of these preliminary findings, they're going to be based on 15 of the 21 interviews, so 70% of the interviews in Durham. In a second, you're going to feel like you have deja vu, because I'm going to refresh your memory on the 2 models as I begin with some just overarching takeaways, and then I'm going to walk you through a bit of the data. And from now on, I'm going to color code the theories, so from here on out, you'll see them more easily. Police effectiveness elements are in red or maroon, and then procedural justice is going to be in blue. So participants place vital importance on procedural justice. From the attributes and behaviors participants want officers to exhibit, to the skill set they believe training can and should hone, participants richly detail a desire for voice, impartiality, respect, and benevolence at the individual officer level and at the agency level. They give examples of when officers have acted in accordance with these preferences, when they have not, and why they believe they should aspire to. Yet, the immediacy with which interviewees also voice concern over their personal safety from criminals indicates a potency, even pungency, in their demands for police effectiveness that makes untenable academics' attempts to subordinate their yearnings to procedural justice. So for example, this is my exchange with Dion, 24 years old, and this is the only time that I'm going to show you a full exchange, because generally my words don't matter, but in this case, I think it's important to show the entire exchange. If you could have the full attention and concern of anyone in power to fix or improve anything, what would it be? God. To fix what or improve what? Fix the stuff, the environment that I'm in, my surroundings. And to do what with them? Make my surroundings, make it safe. Make it safe for people to walk out here and stuff. Right now, it ain't safe for nobody to be walking out here. This fundamental concern for personal safety, as well as safety of those they love and those they do not know personally, such as children and elderly, never strays too far from top of mind for participants. This is why interviewees frequently pivot from police effectiveness preferences to procedural justice or vice versa. And I find that participants frequently draw on elements of both the procedural justice theory and police effectiveness theory when evaluating officers and agencies. Often they're toggling between the models at different points throughout the interview. Sometimes they interweave components of both models into the same thought. And the latter can happen when they consider them independently, for example, sharing a desire for safety and dignity in the same encounter. But the interweaving can also occur when participants see elements of one model as informing the other. So I want to share just a few examples of when participants naturally combine these two theories. So this is Elijah, 27 years old. And Elijah glides from officers protecting the safety of elderly and children to officers guiding youth. This stated preference for police officers to guide young people emerges as a theme in the Durham conversations. I never ask the men about children or elderly, and yet it literally comes up in every single conversation, often more than once. So here's how Elijah responds when asked what police would have to do in order to get an A in his book. Get an A. I would say you got to, my main thing is the younger people and the older people. I would say if they protect them, I'll give them an A. The younger, the kids, that's the ones that need it right now. You know, there's a whole generation coming behind me. So they're gonna need guidance because right now it's some, but it's not enough. Like Elijah, Dion juxtaposes children's safety and the benevolence inherent in the act of guidance. But Dion fleshes out what he means by guidance a bit more. This is Dion's response when asked what is good about the police community relationship. He says, polices, they try to give to the community, like with the give back to school. They help the community with that by keeping kids safe while they're out there getting their book bags and stuff, talking to the kids, asking them what they want to be when they grow up. So they really is doing for the community by being out there watching. That's their job, keeping trouble from out the community. That's what you got to do, man. Just show up. Here, Dion first invokes the police effectiveness model by talking about officers preventing harm to the children by vigilantly guarding against threats. In an unbroken thought, he moves from safety to the benevolence component of procedural justice. Officers are not solely watching out for criminals. Officers are having conversations with children that show they care about them, so much so that they're asking them about their futures and their dreams. Tommy, 27, shows how interviewees at times also consciously wrestle with wanting effective policing and fair treatment. His tortured risk calculation speaks to the importance of positionality. Here he answers how to improve the community police relationship. He says it's a mixed emotion because if people in trouble, they're gonna call the police. But if the police do harm to us and treat us wrong, then we hate the police. You really can't say anything about it because you're not gonna handle these things on your own, of course. So you're gonna have to call them. You just gotta have a better relationship. We just gotta know, okay, if I call you, how do I know if I'm in trouble, you're not gonna try to get me, or you're not gonna come and mistakenly shoot anybody. You're not coming and asking questions first. You come in with the gun drawn. It shouldn't be like that. You should come, ask questions, see what's going on, try to get the full story of everything, and then do your investigation and figure out who you're gonna arrest or whatever. So on one hand, Tommy externalizes his desire for several elements of police effectiveness. He wants police to make him feel safer, solve or resolve a conflict, maintain a sense of order, and catch the criminal if appropriate. On the other hand, Tommy raises procedural justice related concerns. He wants officers to make decisions based on facts rather than opinions or personal judgments, listen to all sides before making a decision, and treat people fairly. In conclusion, participants openly acknowledge the difficulty and danger inherent in a police officer's job, and contend only people with certain attributes and proper training can do the job successfully. As such, participants express perhaps a surprising amount of empathy for quick decisions officers may have to make in prioritizing safety, when they agree that a situation is fraught and warrants such measures. Yet nearly all participants insist officers should consistently practice respectful communication and intentional relationship building in the community, both to reduce the officer's own threat level to the participant and community at large, and to equip the officer to more accurately discern real security threats. Rather than assessing any given interaction as effective or successful based on whether it falls under one model or the other, in their judgment, participants so often pull elements of both models out that it is not useful for scholars to continue separating the two. Neither is it useful for scholars to insist to law enforcement that they emphasize one model over the other to accord with communities' supposed priorities. In other words, procedural justice does not appear to operate as some sort of customer service amenity that is part of a trade-off against protection. Rather, officers' use of gathering input to properly assess a situation and their display of respect and care are entwined in the participants' sense of their own, even existential safety, either indicating that officers' ability to protect and serve them against violent criminals, or that officers' potential to inflict injury or death. These are the risk calculations participants make using officers' words and gestures, or lack thereof, as signals, not recognizing the positionality of community members who face substantially greater risk of criminal and police violence obscures this nuanced assessment of officers and agencies and inhibits us from taking a full accounting of the psychological impact interactions devoid of procedural justice leave. In participants' refusal to choose between police effectiveness and procedural justice, they reveal that public safety can only be achieved by holding both in balance. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ajane. Our next presenter is Arvind Krishnamurthy. Arvind is a fourth-year PhD student in political science in the political behavior and race and ethnic politics subfields. Arvind's research agenda includes the study of politics of criminal justice in America, focusing on questions of racial inequality and institutional design using causal inference methods. Arvind shared with me, 2 summers ago, my cousin interned at The Daily Show with Trevor Noah and was able to get him some friends' tickets to attend the taping of an episode. Arvind, I'm extremely disturbed that I was not a part of the friend part because I do enjoy Trevor Noah. That's neither here nor there. So Arvind and his friends all went to New York and attended a showing, but unbeknownst to Arvind, The Daily Show has a roast comedian who warms up the audience by doing some crowd work before the show actually begins. And Arvind and his friends were spotted in the audience, I guess, as roastable, though Arvind thinks that his cousin, the intern, told the comedian to make fun of him. So this warm-up comedian asks Arvind, what does he do for a living? And Arvind says, oh, I'm a political science PhD student, to which the comedian replies, so you're actually getting a PhD in a wannabe lawyer field, and that you should drop out and join a boy band because that's the only way someone is going to listen to you. Well, we are here this evening, Arvind, to listen to what you have to say. I know that you're familiar with the tough crowd, so this should be fairly simple after that. Arvind Krishnamurthy.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you, Ajane, for that fantastic presentation, and thank you to the graduate school and Dean McClain and everyone on this committee for setting up these fantastic conversations I'm excited to be a part of. So my talk and presentation is on some ongoing research that's part of my broader research agenda, which is related to the connection between democracy and policing, specifically the connection between democracy, racial inequality, and policing in America, and how we can create all these systems and integrate them together. What's the relationship between them? And I want to start by explaining the motivation for this work. And that motivation, it begins in 2014 with the killing of Michael Brown by Officer Darren Wilson in Ferguson, Missouri. And as we all know, a lot of the coverage focused on the protests that followed, and the protests that followed as a result of the ruling for no indictment on Officer Darren Wilson. Along with that, we saw militarized policing from Ferguson, from the National Guard, and broadly rise as a trend throughout America. The Department of Justice ended up issuing a report where they investigated the Ferguson Police Department. And they investigated the Ferguson Police Department and concluded that they found a pattern of discrimination among the officers in Ferguson. And that pattern of discrimination included targeting of Black residents, both for extracting fines and fees and an increased likelihood of use of force. And this pattern of discrimination is directly related to the mobilization we saw, the protest activity and the civil unrest in Ferguson following the killing of Michael Brown by an officer. I think for many, and in the media often, the sort of the narrative, that's where the story stopped. That's what most of the focus was on in Ferguson. However, that's not necessarily where the story really did end. In Ferguson, we saw that the first election that they had after the tragic killing of Michael Brown resulted in record voter turnout. We saw voters mobilize, not just mobilized to engage in protests, but also mobilized to go to the polls, specifically in the ward, the geographic unit closest to where Michael Brown was killed. We saw Wesley Bell elected. And Wesley Bell, in fact, was elected with record voter turnout in that ward. And Wesley Bell now is actually the district attorney in Ferguson. Central to his campaign was a focus on police reform and racial justice. In Ferguson, we also saw just 2 years ago, Leslie McSpadden, who's pictured here. McSpadden is actually Michael Brown's mother. And this image comes from a speech where she announced that she was running for office. She was running for Ferguson City Council. And the reason she stated that she was running for City Council is because she was mobilized by the injustice that she saw at the hands of the state and state actors. And she wanted to engage deeply with politics to create change. That's sort of the central puzzle that I'm interested in looking at in this paper and broadly in my research agenda, which is we have a lot of evidence both in American politics and broadly outside of America that when the state engages in violence against its own citizens, those citizens are likely to mobilize, often engaging in contentious politics or non-electoral participation through actions like protests. But what we have less research on is the idea that this injustice can mobilize residents to participate in electoral politics, mobilize residents to turn out and vote. And that's the research question that I'm trying to address here in this presentation. Are individuals mobilized to participate in electoral politics following state violence? The existing research on this topic is relatively mixed. First, there's an agenda of research that focuses on some of the spillover effects of police violence. That is, it focuses on the fact that police violence can have these consequences, including citizens losing trust in the state. For example, there's research that shows after police killings, individuals in those geographic areas, especially when they're have the same racial identification as the individual who was killed by the police, are less likely to call 911 in the weeks following that incident. But we also have this other agenda of research, which has talked about the ways that citizens can be mobilized rather than withdrawing from the state. They actually become more likely to engage with the state. And one example of that comes from felon disenfranchisement, where there's really good research that's showing, done by Allison and Nolan Mackenzie Israel Tummel, that shows that after felon disenfranchisement laws are passed, highly punitive and racially targeted policies, individuals that have close social ties to individuals who are disenfranchised by these policies actually become more likely to vote, engaging in what they call surrogate participation. That is, they're mobilized by the injustice to engage with the state in an attempt to make change in these electoral institutions and more broadly in politics. So that sort of brings me to my theoretical argument in this research. My argument is that exposure to police violence can mobilize potential voters when they believe these incidents are part of a broader systemic problem. And the question then is, what's the mechanism that's driving that? What leads them to go from thinking this is part of a systemic problem to turning out at the polls? And I argue that, in line with a lot of work in political psychology, that it can be the emotion of anger. That anger can be a mobilizing emotion, especially when that anger is built around the belief that some system in politics is unjust, and that engagement with politics can be a way to change that. So to recap sort of the theoretical argument I'm laying out, it's that when there's incidents of police violence, belief that there's a systemic problem, especially a systemic problem in this case, given the historical circumstances in this country, of racialized state violence, it can lead to anger, which we know mobilizes individuals and might, in this case, mobilize them to participate in electoral politics. So to test this idea, I merged geocoded data from Mapping Police Violence, which is a data set that collects all incidents of police violence against civilians. And as I'm sure many of you know, that it's not the case that there are government databases of this information. That's where we've had to see a lot of nonprofit institutions and journalistic outlets like the Washington Post engage in collecting these databases. Mapping Police Violence tries to merge a number of other data sets to build their own comprehensive data set of police violence. And with that, they include a number of geographic information. I connect that data and merge it with geocoded survey data from the 2016 Cooperative Congressional Election Study. And the main benefit out of doing this is I can connect information about the geographic area of where police violence is taking place with survey responses from respondents that can tell us their opinions on a number of political issues. In addition, the CCES also gives us something called validated vote info, which means that they are able to tell us not just whether or not someone on a survey said they were going to turn out or not, but they can actually tell us whether that individual did turn out using voter files that they've procured that tell us validated through these voter files and that they gather from state departments, whether or not an individual did turn out. So using this data, I am able to engage in analysis that can connect the geographic unit of a resident with the geographic unit of the police killing. And you can see here, this is a map to give you a sense of the geographic distribution of police shootings in this data set between 2013 and election day on 2016, which is the data I'm using for my analysis. And finally, this data relates to some of the characteristics or auxiliary data that goes along with the police violence data set. And if you have questions about this data, I'm happy to get into it more in Q&A. So one of the difficulties here with this kind of research is that police violence is not randomly assigned. If I'm interested in the effect of police violence on electoral mobilization, I can't simply compare residents in counties with police killings of civilians to residents in counties that I don't have any police killings of civilians, because those counties might differ on a number of characteristics that are related to electoral participation. So in line with some existing research, I leverage the fact that while exposure to police violence, while whether or not you live in a county or area where police violence against civilians is happening is non-random, whether that violence occurs in the days before or after an election is plausibly as good as random. That is, I can treat the timing of the fatal police citizen encounter, whether it's just before the election or just after the election, as a natural experiment. And doing so, I can say that these counties are more or less the same, and the individuals who were exposed are more or less the same. It just so happened that some of them were exposed to police violence in their county in the weeks or month before the election, and some happened to have it in the weeks or month after the election. And I can use that randomness to generate the effect of police violence on electoral mobilization. And to give you a sense, I ran balance tests for a number of demographic characteristics for the respondents in my sample. And I also looked across a number of demographic information for the counties. But this also shows that there is no relationship between the number of police shootings on a day and election day. Both before and after election day, we see it's about the same amount of police killings. And these differences between before and after election, they are not statistically significant, which is suggestive evidence that this is a plausible identification strategy. And so the dependent variable here is validated presidential voter turnout. Now, importantly, there are two limits to using this validated voter turnout. The first is that oftentimes individuals can't be found on voter files. And to deal with that, I impute to determine their likelihood of voting if they're not able to be found based on a number of other characteristics that we know correlate with voting, like education, age, and political interest. And the other big limit is that I'm only able to get validated vote for the presidential election. And like I talked about in that motivating case with Ferguson, there's a number of reasons to think that maybe presidential vote is not the area where we would see most of the mobilization happening. For example, you might think that individuals are mobilized to vote in more local elections, things like district attorney or city council, especially given that these local jurisdictions are likely to be the ones that have the ability to allocate funds. And in future work, I hope to gather that kind of data, and I'd love to talk more about what you all think about this approach later on. The predictor variables in my analysis are that timing of the police shooting, like I mentioned, whether or not there was a police violence against a civilian in the county that the survey respondent is just before the election, or it was just after. And also that measure of belief in there being a systematic problem. So survey responses, in this case to the question, rate your level of agreement with the following statement. Racial problems in the US are rare and isolated situations. Now, this measure again is limited in some ways, and I hope to conduct my own survey analysis, and I'll talk a little bit about my plans to do that at the end of this talk. But this allows me to get at some sense of the idea that there's a problem of systemic racism in America, and that, as I theorized earlier, might be one of the key motivating factors in connecting these police shootings to a belief that you need to turn to electoral politics to make change. And these are the results. I'll present a few figures and I'll explain them briefly. This first figure here is just the raw comparison of voter turnout among individuals who reside in counties that had a police killing in those 60 days before the election, and individuals who reside in a county that had a police killing in the 60 days after the election. It's not including any evidence of my mechanism that I mentioned earlier, the belief in there being a systematic problem of racism or racial violence in America. And you can see here that there is a difference across conditions, that if you reside in a county that had a police killing pre-election in the CCES, those survey respondents are about 2% more likely to engage in participation in the 2016 presidential election. But these differences are not statistically significant at the 0.95 level. They're weakly significant. They're significant at the 0.9 level. And to put it in substantive terms, it's the difference between a 43% likelihood of turning out and a 41% likelihood of turning out. Now, when we disaggregate these results by race, we do find some significant effects. So, for example, we see that among Hispanic respondents in my data set and white survey respondents in my data set, self-identified, there's no difference there's no statistically significant difference in the likelihood of voting based on whether or not you were in a county that had a police killing before the election in those 60 days, or you were in a county that had a police killing in the 60 days after the election. In fact, the entire effect that we saw in that previous figure is driven by Black respondents, who are 6% more likely to turn out when there is a police killing in the 60 days immediately before the election. And in other words, the way I suggest we can interpret that information is that the police killings lead to a 6% increase in electoral participation among Black residents. We see here also that these effects are concentrated based on the race of the victim of the police killing. Specifically, we see that there's a 5% difference in the likelihood of turning out pre-election versus post-election when the race of the victim killed is Black. And again, these effects are concentrated among Black survey respondents rather than white or Hispanic survey respondents. Now, this last figure illustrates the measure I indicated was my mechanism. the factor that's driving participation, and in this case, beliefs that racial problems are rare, that survey measure that I mentioned on the CCES. Now, what you find here is that I'm unable to find any significant effects. For example, I find that there's no relationship between your belief in the idea that racial problems are rare or more common or systemic and your likelihood of turning out in the election. So the takeaways that I'm able to provide from this ongoing work is that there is some evidence of electoral mobilization among Black respondents in response to police violence against Black residents. But I'm not able to find evidence of the mechanism that's driving this mobilization. Now, that's kind of the focus of the work that I want to continue to do. So there are a couple of ideas and concepts that I'm interested in focusing on to try and make sense of these findings. The first is to look at the data on protests and see if these protests themselves are actually directly related to the electoral mobilization that we might see happening. Specifically, if many of the associated Black Lives Matter protests following police killings are actually forces for registering and turning out voters. And in fact, there's a lot of suggestive evidence and evidence from journalists that shows that this has been a central focus of Black Lives Matter. Another is to look at survey data that asks individuals whether or not they view voting as a tool for change in the area of criminal justice, or whether or not they think protest is the means for change, and when that is the case. A really hard question here is what kinds of forms of accountability individuals want to have in order to create change in an issue like policing and police violence. It's not clear always that turning to electoral institutions is the approach that residents of these communities might want. Oftentimes it might be that protest is a more effective tool or viewed as a more likely tool to achieve their goals. Next, this data is limited to 2016, where I'm looking at the presidential vote. And as I mentioned earlier, local politics in many ways seem like the area where there's more direct relationship between voting and police outcomes. And finally, and most importantly, and this really in many ways gets back in part to Ajane's work that she presented here today, who and how are people being mobilized? That is, what are the networks, the community organizations, the activists, and the narrative and the conversations and narratives that these individuals are having that are leading them to decide that they might be interested in using the vote to create change here. Thank you, and that's everything I have. I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Ajane and Arvin, for your presentations. I would stop and make a pause here to say, I'm so proud that if we were in a mixed audience, I would use this as a recruitment time, but we are all a part of the Duke family, and I want to make sure we have time for question and answer. So my colleagues and I are monitoring the chat room, and we thank you for your questions. And I also would like for you to pose questions, but I do want to get us started. One question that we have from the chat room is, can you talk about case studies in communities that have reduced their police force? And I'll pose it to each of you, but Ajane, I'll start with you. The question was, can you talk about are there case studies, in other words, in communities that have reduced their police force?
That's a great question, and definitely something that I need to do some digging on. I'm not aware of, I mean, certainly there have been, for economic reasons, there have been like layoffs or things like that that have happened. And so I haven't looked at those specifically to see what the outcomes of those were. I will say that this is something that I will address formally on the London sample because there were austerity measures that produced across the board cuts, not only for police, but for social services. And this is literally something that came up in virtually every single conversation. So the disinvestment, I mean, so there was a profound effect by the cutting of 38,000 police officers from the Metropolitan Police Force. And that affected all kinds of things, including response time. As crime was rising, knife crime in particular, murders, homicides, gun crime, And so that was something that entered into their conversations, and the response time for a lot of things taking as much as 45 minutes to an hour. But also major disinvestments in youth. And so in education and youth clubs and places that were safe for them to be after school. And so I think there are implications, particularly because of the conversations that are now being had about defunding the police. And so I think, some of the conversations that happened in London have direct bearing on and how we might think about that in the US.
Yeah, I think Ajane covered that really well. The only thing I'd add is that there is some really interesting work looking at how variation in the size or budget of policing relates to policing outcomes and outcomes like even crime, and also alternative uses of funds. For example, investment in things like community organizations or even environmental policies, things like adding more streetlights or reducing vacant lots that are really, really effective and cost effective at reducing crime and disorder in communities. So that's an interesting sort of area of work that's related to the question of what happens when communities are reducing the size of their police force.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. And there are a lot of things that forces can do beyond kind of cutting the hours. They can redistribute the shifts, to in sometimes forces are better at using data to do that than others. So sometimes they're just like these across the board, very crude kinds of cuts versus, really being driven by data to look at where the best match is for drawing down some of the forces.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat room from our colleague Luke. Luke, thank you for, he says, this is directed toward Arvin, but please both of you chime in if you can. And Luke is interested to know, Arvin, if you have any thoughts about how individuals' beliefs regarding how likely that electoral engagement is to result in meaningful change might modify your proposed mechanism of anger driving electoral engagement. Is this a factor that you could measure in your results?
Yeah, I think that's a great point and exactly the kind of thing I'm thinking about moving forward. There are a lot of these measures that are related to a concept of efficacy, which is kind of the idea of how much does my voice matter? How much is my voice likely to make a difference in politics? And sometimes that's used to look at electoral engagement, but can also be used to look at non-electoral engagement too. And that balance, thinking about when individuals think that their voice is likely to make a big difference in creating change electorally or non-electorally, whether that's through civic organizations, protests, community organizations, or using their voice at the ballot box. Not that those are, of course, exclusive outcomes, but in a way of thinking about what do people want to most spend their time on. And so my hope is I can gather some original survey data and even do some qualitative research talking to folks and see kind of what people are thinking about that. But it's definitely something I want to do and hope to do in the future.
Yeah, there's been a lot of work done on linked fate. Michael Dawson is, really popularized this concept, but particularly when it comes to African Americans and political views. But basically the idea that it's rational when you're thinking about policy preferences, to think about what would happen to other people of your same group and use that as a sort of shortcut to think about what your own personal outcomes might be, and that your fate is linked to that. And so there's a lot of, African Americans are the highest, the group that sort of shares this sense more than any other group in the United States. And this is something that potentially is underlying some of that motivation to act. And so, a concern for what can happen to other folks in your group, but also that could potentially affect you or those that you love. And so that's something that I'm formally looking at in this Durham study. And I've asked the participants, basically how well they identify or how much they identify with folks that they've seen in the African-American men in the media that have been killed by police officers. How likely do they think that they are going to be, that it is that they will be harmed, that someone they care about will be harmed or killed? And quite frankly, in the scale, I made an error, because what I did not account for is several participants having a little trouble calculating that risk because it had already happened. That there were so many people that they knew that had already been killed by police officers, that then they didn't know if they were more likely for that to happen again or less likely for that to happen again. So actually, so these questions are certainly ones that that I'm wrestling with, and actually want to talk to Arvin more to make sure that I'm covering bases. But there's so much there that you can't be all things to all people. So I think we'll just be taking different slices and then continuing, frankly, to unpack this in future work.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Senior Associate Dean Jacqueline Looney, and she wants to know, Arvin and Ajane, how do you envision your work in this area informing public policy? How does what you do now, how are you informing public policy?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer first, Ajane, if that's all right. And yeah, I guess just really quickly, the way I sort of actually got first into research on policing and racial bias was actually during my undergraduate education. I did research that looked at racial bias in traffic stops, and we did a report on the Texas Department of Public Safety, and it was presented in the Texas state legislature. And actually, I got a piece of mail that was a legislator in Texas arguing with us, saying that we'd done the statistics incorrectly. And it kind of was a moment where it gave me a window into seeing that the research you do, especially on a very public policy relevant topic like this, can and is heard by many of the people who are making the policies in this area. And so you have to do a really, really careful, good job to make sure you're doing the best in upholding, sort of the training we've been given here. And then sort of broadly, there's definitely normative reasons why this is the area that I'm focused on. I think this is one of the major crises in America and American politics, and even across the world, but especially given my research focus in American politics. And my hope is that by doing the research on this, we can, one, see the way that communities mobilize in response to injustice and try to fight to create change, and also see that whether or not democracy and state violence, how we can use democracy to fight back against these unjust actions by the state.
I mean, this is one of the reasons that I got this PhD in public policy. So this is, I love policy so much. And, just beginning with the dissertation, I really want to be driven by the recommendations of the participants. And so I'm purposely withholding my own personal, views or opinions about what those policies should be. But I can tell from the conversations that I've had so far that they're going to be policy recommendations to both police leaders and to municipal leaders and nonprofit actors that want to have a role in the space around hiring, around training, around accountability, and how resources at the municipal level should be redistributed.
Our next question, and point of privilege, Elliot, if you will forgive me, I'm going to ask you to unmute because you asked a two-part question, one to Arvin and one to Ajane, and I think you can more succinctly, put that out there. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, Dean Kendrick. And I would just like to say these are two of the best presentations I think I've seen while at Duke. A question for Arvind: is there something uniquely mobilizing about police violence as opposed to other forms of state violence in your view? And a question for Ajane: did any of the data you collected talk about the importance of representation in the police force? a police force that looks like the people that are being served?
Yeah, great questions. I think that's a question that I'm still trying to wrestle with, because a lot of the work on state violence is actually outside the American context. So it's forced me to read more broadly about work on state violence, and I think it's not clear to me that it necessarily might be unique, but I think I probably need to do more work there to understand that. But there is also a unique history of police as sort of the state's front line in engaging with a lot of island violence and order maintenance, especially throughout American history, from going all the way back to Reconstruction and further. And so, given that knowledge, it wouldn't surprise me if it was unique, but I don't know that I have a definite answer other than to say it's something I want to spend more time trying to figure out. Thank you.
Yeah, fantastic questions, Elliot. Thank you for those. You know, it's interesting. I mean, certainly the participants talk a lot about the direct threats from some police, but they also talk about, you know, I had to create a code for the language, "They let us die." In which is heartbreaking. That comes up enough that I actually had to create a code for it. So there's a sort of two-part to the state violence. There's the direct violence from the state, but then there's a sort of violent neglect that they talk about. And so I'll be talking about that, you know, in my dissertation. On the representation question, you know, they don't ask, I mean, or excuse me, I don't ask specifically about that, but a lot of them do talk about it, a lot of them. And even though they talk about wanting more representation, it's not just like descriptive. I mean, basically there are a couple of pieces to it. It's specific to understanding the culture of where they are. So not just that being Black would take care of that, but that someone who understands that community, who comes from that community, or who has been entrenched in that community, can better police that community. And also, but also leaving room for folks to invest, that if they don't get it, they can get it by making an effort. And so they talk a lot about effort, and that's something that I'm gonna talk a lot in the dissertation, and relationship building, and that's where a lot of that focus should be. But the representation thing comes up both in Durham and in London, and quite frankly, a lot of folks talk about how well some of the white police officers have done. That, you know, that they do have that, and that they have had positive experiences with white officers, and so, you know, there's that hopefulness there. And the more contact they have with law enforcement, the more willing they are to look at them as individuals, which is also something very interesting that comes out.
Thanks. I do want to thank you all for your time. I have one last question that one of your colleagues has posed. This will be the last question because I want to stay true. We've gone over just a little bit, but again, I appreciate that, you know, the conversation is so lively that I did not want to cut us off. In fact, my assistant dean colleagues and all of my other colleagues, you know, they said, Alan, this is good, don't cut it off, or we'll get you. I don't know what that get me part means, but we'll work that out later. But Alicia Florwick does pose a question. She asks, with all the flaws that people point out in the electoral process, she gives some examples: the two-party system, big money in politics, the electoral college, gerrymandering. How do you, Arvin and Ajane, think that these variables move the needle on your conclusions? And how would you control or consider these aspects of unfairness?
You mind repeating the question?
Yeah, she says, with all the flaws people point out in the electoral process, some examples: money, two-party system, gerrymandering. How do you think that these variables move the needle on your conclusions in your research? And how would you control or consider these aspects of unfairness?
Mm.
That's a fantastic question. Yeah. I don't know if you feel like you have an answer right away, Ashane, or because I know that I certainly don't. I think I'd need to think about it more, but I think that is one of the questions that is motivating this research for me, which is how do we think about when you're trying to fight back against state violence, state injustice, what tools you have at your disposal and which one of those tools you think is most effective to spend your time on. Obviously, you can engage in multiple approaches, but to some extent, respondent, my survey respondents, individuals, they're having to go through that calculus themselves. And I think you're right to point out that there are a lot of limits in the electoral approach, and I think that is why I'm not necessarily convinced that it's the only approach to creating change in fighting back against, in my paper, for example, police violence. So yeah, I think that's just sort of my thoughts on it. I don't know that I have the answer on that one, because that's a really great question.
Yeah, I mean, that was a great answer because that was a powerful question. Yeah, I mean, certainly those pose challenges, the flaws of the system. I mean, they're done by design, so they're quite effective. And it takes a lot to overcome that. And things like the census count as well, which also play into representation, right? And the farming out of prisoners to rural areas and in places where those folks are counted in those prisons far away from where they come, and in those areas, those rural, often quite white areas, having disproportionate power in the legislatures and in Congress as well. So but politics is local. I don't know that all politics is local, but a lot of politics is local. And I don't think we should underestimate the power of holding folks accountable where they are, and sort of making presence known and applying pressure. It works. And so, it's a long game.
Thank you so much. And I do need to make a note of apology here to Alicia Florwick. Her the pronouns that they use are they and them. So I hope that they will accept my apology, and we thank them for their question. And that's my pit bull telling me to hush and move on. We have come to the end of our conversation about researching the police. And I want to introduce my assistant dean colleague, Dr. Cisco Ramos, who has been a vital partner on this endeavor for the graduate school. So if you don't know already, Dean Ramos will be teaching GS 761, Diverse Learners and Contentious Issues. And I believe, Cisco, this course is open to PhD students who have passed preliminary exams in their respective departments. And if after this evening you are interested in delving deeper into topics about bias, diversity, and inclusion, you definitely want to social distance next semester. Let's go. Dr. Ramos.
Thank you, Alan. Good evening, everyone. On for the planning team for the Graduate School's Race and Bias Conversation series, as well as all members of the Graduate School, I want to begin by saying thank you for attending tonight's event. I don't know about you, but I feel very proud tonight because Ajanai and Arvind are using scholarship to address the most pressing issues of our time. So please join me in giving a special thank you to Ajanai and Arvind for presenting and leading tonight's discussion. And in a moment, everyone will receive a brief follow-up note where we will welcome suggestions from the Duke community about potential topics for future conversations in this series. If you have an idea that you would like to share, you are most welcome to do so. And as we're beginning to wind down the semester, please remember to stay safe, enjoy the small things, and I look forward to seeing you at our next event on Thursday, January 28th, 2021, where we will be joined by Dr. Kim Hewitt, who is Duke's Vice President for Institutional Equity and Chief Diversity Officer. Have a wonderful evening and good night.